They laughed when a desperate man spent his last $2,000 on 50 acres of toxic mosquito-infested swamp. The entire town called him a fool. But buried deep beneath that suffocating mud lay a raw geological secret, and a high-stakes gamble that would push him to the brink of an armed standoff with his most ruthless rival. The sun over Briarwood, Louisiana, did not shine. It baked, a heavy, unyielding weight that turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage of dust and heat. It was the summer of 2008, a period when the global financial architecture was fracturing. But on County Road 9, the devastation was purely elemental. A relentless 2-year drought had turned the once fertile topsoil of the southern basin into a pale, powdery expanse, crosshatched with deep, jagged fissures. For miles, fields of corn and soybeans stood stunted, their leaves bleached yellow and curled inward like withered fingers. The air smelled of scorched earth and dead vegetation, a dry, static haze that offered no relief, even as the sun dipped below the tree line. In the center of this wasteland stood Edmund Pendleton. At 42 years old, his face was a roadmap of weathered lines, his hands calloused from decades of labor that had suddenly ceased to yield returns. Edmund was a fourth-generation farmer, a man whose identity was intricately bound to the soil beneath his boots. His great-grandfather had cleared these acres with a team of mules. His father had sustained them through the economic downturns of the 1980s. Now, that entire ancestral legacy was poised on the edge of a precipice. The drought had starved the land, but the sudden, systemic collapse of the banking system had provided the finishing blow. Local credit lines had evaporated overnight. The regular operating loans that sustained family farms between planting and harvest were gone, replaced by automated notices and rigid, unsympathetic letters from corporate lenders. Edmund stood on his front porch, a stack of certified mail resting on the wooden railing beside him. The most recent document from the Regional Agricultural Bank was explicit. Without a significant capital injection or a total liquidation of his outstanding debts, foreclosure proceedings would commence within 90 days. The bank was already calculating the auction value of his equipment, his barns, and the house his grandfather had built. Every acre he walked felt less like a possession and more like a debt he could never repay. The psychological burden was a constant, suffocating pressure, a quiet desperation that kept him awake long into the sweltering nights, listening to the dry wind rattle through the dead crops, searching for an exit from a trap that nature and economics had combined to spring upon him. The interior of the Briarwood County Courthouse smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the dense, stale heat of a building whose cooling system had long since given up the fight. It was Tuesday morning, the day of the annual tax deed auction, an event that had transformed from a routine bureaucratic necessity into a grim liquidation of the county's independent farmers. The wood-paneled room was packed with weathered men in faded denim, their faces cast in shadows as they watched the dissolution of their neighbors' lives. Edmund Pendleton sat near the back, his posture rigid, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He had no capital to deploy. He was there out of a morbid, protective instinct, wanting to see exactly who would claim the remnants of the valley. At the front of the room stood Mayor Thomas Higgins, acting as the auctioneer. Higgins was a politician who viewed the community's misfortune as a ledger to be balanced, his red face slick with perspiration as he hammered down parcel after parcel with clinical efficiency. Beside the podium sat Jacob Miller, the undisputed titan of Briarwood's agricultural sector. Miller owned 2,000 acres of heavily irrigated, prime riverfront land, property that had survived the drought through deep-set, prioritized county water rights. He carried the unearned, heavy swagger of inherited security, his presence a deliberate calculation to intimidate the desperate men around him. For years, Miller had hovered over Edmund's borders, offering insulting pennies on the dollar for the Pendleton homestead, waiting for the drought to finally break Edmund's resolve. As Higgins read off the defaulted properties, Miller would occasionally glance back at Edmund, a thin, patronizing smirk cutting across his features. The auction was not merely a business transaction for Miller. It was a theater of dominance, a public display of how wealth could insulate a man from the very weather that broke his peers. Every strike of the gavel felt like a systemic erasure of self-made survival, in favor of corporate expansion. The humiliation in the room was palpable. A heavy silence, broken only by the scratching of clerks' pens and the monotone voice of the mayor parsing out the bones of the county. Edmund watched the predatory alliance between the political machinery and Miller's capital, feeling the walls of the valley closing in on his own legacy. "Next lot," Mayor Higgins bellowed, tapping his gavel against the wooden podium. "Parcel 402, 50 acres down on the Southern Basin, commonly known as the Old Blackwood Tract, or, as most of you know it, the Whispering Bog." A ripple of dry chuckle passed through the crowded courtroom. The bog was a local legend of futility, a 50-acre depression filled with stagnant blackwater, rotting cypress stumps, and a prehistoric layer of mud that had once swallowed a timber company's entire diesel skidder. It was considered a toxic liability, a breeding ground for water moccasins that had been abandoned since the mid-20th century. "County assesses the back taxes at $2,000, Higgins said, shifting his weight. "Do I hear a opening bid? Jacob, you looking to add a swamp to your portfolio?" Jacob Miller scoffed loudly, not even bothering to turn around. "I wouldn't take that rotting sinkhole if the county paid me the $2,000, Thomas. Skip it and move to the river tracks." Edmund stared at the grainy plat map projected onto the courthouse screen. While the room saw a worthless abyss, his mind raced back 30 years to his grandfather's journals from the Arkansas lowlands. His grandfather had always insisted that a true farmer doesn't fight the natural topography. He exploits it. Edmund had walked the northern edge of that bog a week prior. He had noted how the water sat perfectly level, refusing to drain or drop even at the height of a 2-year drought. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He had exactly $2,400 remaining in his personal emergency savings, the final barrier protecting his family from immediate utility cutoffs. If he spent it, he was stepping onto a tightrope over a canyon. Edmund raised a weathered hand. 2,000. The room fell instantly silent, save for the mechanical hum of a window air unit. Mayor Higgins blinked in disbelief. Jacob Miller spun around in his chair, his face twisting into an expression of raw contempt. "Pendleton, you've lost your mind," Miller muttered loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You can't grow corn in a swamp. You're throwing your last dime into a puddle of rot." Edmund ignored the whispers that began to swell around him. He walked down the center aisle toward the clerk's desk, completely isolated in his gamble, knowing he had just traded his final safety net for 50 acres of black water. The physical reality of the Whispering Bog was far more hostile than the courthouse maps had suggested. On his first morning, Edmund parked his rusted 1982 John Deere 4440 tractor at the edge of the property line, stepping out into a wall of thick, sulfurous air. The stench of decaying vegetation and stagnant, unmoving water was immediate and suffocating, hanging heavy under a dense canopy of ancient, dead cypress trees. The landscape looked entirely primeval, a chaotic maze of sharp cypress knees and floating mats of dark organic debris. To make the land viable for any structured agricultural trial, he needed to clear decades of wild growth and rotted timber. Edmund attached a heavy-duty rotary cutter to the tractor's rear hitch and backed the machine into the dark mud. Within 10 feet, the rear tires broke through the thin upper crust. The massive tread spun uselessly, churning up a thick, black mire that smelled of ancient rot. The engine bogged down, its mechanical roar dropping to a strained whine before coughing a plume of black diesel smoke and stalling completely. The tractor was stuck up to its steel axles. Sitting alone in the sweltering, unmoving air of the cab, surrounded by an immediate swarm of biting horseflies, Edmund felt a crushing wave of self-doubt. The town had been right. This was not farmland. It was a physical sinkhole designed to swallow capital and labor without trace. Realizing that heavy machinery was a liability until the surface was stabilized, Edmund used a manual come-along winch and a sturdy oak tree to drag the John Deere backward onto the hard road. He would have to face the bog on its own terms, by hand. Armed with a chainsaw, a heavy machete, and rubber waders that reached his chest, he stepped off the bank into the waist-deep black water. The environment was physically volatile. Submerged logs caught his boots, and the dark water hid rusted iron from old illegal dumping. On the third day, His blade split the water inches from a dormant water moccasin. His muscles burned. His hands blistered beneath his gloves, and the sheer scale of the 50-acre abyss loomed over him like an impossible sentence. He was one man against a primeval wetland, fighting for inches of raw mud. The transition from madness to method required data. On a humid Tuesday morning, Dr. Harrison Reed, a senior agronomist from the State University, stood at the edge of the basin looking profoundly out of place. Wearing pristine khakis and adjusting a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, Reed stared into the black water of the bog. "Edmund, I came out here because I owe you for pulling my truck from that ditch last winter," Reed said, shaking his head. "But this is an ecological graveyard. The surface water here is stagnant and highly acidic. If you drop seed into this, the pH levels will fry the embryo before it can even attempt to root." "I didn't ask you down here to look at the water, Harry," Edmund replied evenly. He handed the academic a 3-foot hollow steel core sampling tube with a T-bar handle. "I need you to look at what's underneath the rot. Take a sample right past that first line of cypress knees." Sighing, Reed pulled on a pair of rubber boots and waded carefully into the black muck. He selected a spot, leaned his full weight onto the T-bar, and drove the steel cylinder deep into the basin floor. He twisted the handle to seal the vacuum, pulled the tube free, and waded back to the dry bank. With a wooden dowel, he carefully extruded the long cylinder of compressed soil onto a clean plastic tarp. The top 6 inches were exactly what Reed had predicted, a foul, jet-black sludge of decomposed organic matter. But below that layer, the texture changed abruptly. The material became incredibly dense, smooth, and transitioned into a distinct, pale, grayish-blue hue. Reed knelt directly in the mud, completely forgetting his khakis. He pinched a piece of the blue sediment, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger, flattening it into a perfect, unbroken ribbon that held its shape without cracking. "Smectite blue clay," Reed muttered, his voice dropping its academic detachment. "It's nearly pure. The hydraulic conductivity on this layer is virtually zero." "It's a natural bathtub," Edmund said, a hard grin breaking through his exhaustion. "Exactly," Reed breathed, looking out over the basin with entirely new eyes. "You have an impermeable hardpan. If you can grade this surface, you can flood it and hold the water with almost zero seepage loss. The drought won't touch you." It was the first fragment of validation Edmund had received, transforming a local joke into a serious tactical asset. Understanding the soil profile was merely a theoretical victory. Shaping it required mechanical force. To fund the next phase, Edmund made a hard tactical choice, hauling his specialized 4-row John Deere corn planter, a piece of equipment passed down from his father, to a regional agricultural salvage yard. He traded it straight across for an ancient, weathered Case 80 bulldozer. The machine was a mechanical relic. It had no functioning brakes. Its hydraulic lines leaked a faint, steady mist of fluid, and the steering clutches were so worn that it could only make reliable left-hand turns. However, it possessed one critical advantage. Its tracks were wide, and its total weight was light enough to sit atop the clay pan without sinking into the abyss. By late April, Edmund began the grueling process of terracing the mire. Working punishing 12-hour shifts under an increasingly brutal Louisiana sun, he learned the dangerous dance of operating a brakeless machine on a slick, unstable incline. The tactical objective was precision engineering. He had to follow the natural, microscopic 3-inch gradient of the basin floor, scraping away the acidic top sludge and pushing the heavy blue smectite clay up into structured, winding, retaining walls. Every pass of the blade required absolute, unwavering concentration. If the dozer slid off the crest of a newly formed berm, it would plunge into the deep retention pools, trapping Edmund in an uninsulated steel cage with no way to halt the machine's descent. The physical toll was immense. Without brakes, Edmund had to constantly drop the heavy steel blade into the raw earth to arrest his forward momentum, a violent jarring action that vibrated through his spine and left his lower back locked in a dull, perpetual ache. His hands grew raw and blistered from fighting the stiff, unassisted manual levers that controlled the tracks. Yet, inch by inch, the chaotic topology of the whispering bog began to yield. The ancient, primeval swamp was systematically disassembled and reconstructed into a highly organized, terraced grid of serpentine clay levees. It no longer looked like an abandoned sinkhole. It resembled a highly engineered arena of war, carved out of raw blue earth by a single man who refused to let his family's legacy slip beneath the mud. The physical structure of the rice paddies was complete, but the water trapped within them remained a stagnant hazard. Chemical tests confirmed Dr. Reed's warnings. Decades of decomposing cypress needles had turned the basin floor highly acidic, with a pH level hovering near 4 points. If Edmund sowed his specialized long-grain seed directly into this liquid, the acid would dissolve the protective hull before germination could occur. The entire 50-acre system required an immediate, comprehensive flush. The natural topography dictated only one viable exit. The water had to drain through a shallow, ancient creek bed that cut across the southern boundary line directly into Jacob Miller's land before joining the regional river system. Edmund secured a high-volume diesel water pump on a short-term commercial credit line. He positioned the massive unit at the lowest point of his new clay levees, running a reinforced discharge hose toward the dry creek bed. When the diesel engine fired up, a steady torrent of dark, brackish water began surging down the channel, clearing the path toward Miller's acreage. 2 hours later, the roar of an all-terrain vehicle shattered the valley. Jacob Miller arrived at the property line, flanked by 2 burly farmhands. Miller cut the engine and stepped off the vehicle, his face drawn into a hard, adversarial mask. "Shut that machinery down, Pendleton," Miller commanded, stepping toward the fence line. "You're pouring toxic swamp sludge directly onto my property. That creek bed cuts right alongside my lower soybean infrastructure, and I won't have your acidic garbage contaminating my acreage." "The creek is a designated county drainage easement, Jacob," Edmund replied, keeping his voice flat as he stood by the vibrating pump. "By agricultural statute, I have the legal right to pass natural runoff through it." "Not when that runoff is considered an industrial hazard," Miller countered, a cold, calculated smirk touching his mouth. He pulled a folded legal document from his heavy canvas jacket. "I had my attorney secure a temporary restraining order and a civil injunction this morning. If you discharge 1 more gallon of that water across this line, the county sheriff will be out here by noon to impound your pumping equipment for environmental noncompliance." Edmund stared at the paperwork, then at Miller's unyielding eyes. The psychological trap was absolute. Miller didn't care about his lower soybeans. He wanted the pump confiscated, the credit line broken, and the Pendleton family farm forced onto the auction block. Edmund walked over and cut the engine, the sudden silence of the valley feeling like a total defeat. The silence left by the deactivated diesel pump was a suffocating weight. Edmund sat on the high crest of the main clay levee for hours, watching the sunset reflect off 50 acres of stagnant, acidic water. He was entirely hemmed in by Jacob Miller's legal blockade. He could not drain the system. He could not afford commercial neutralizing agents, and the expensive semi-dwarf seed would rot if the water remained static. He returned to his workshop that night, pulling a stack of his grandfather's leather-bound hydrological notebooks from a cedar chest. He spent hours tracing old hand-drawn diagrams of early delta irrigation schemes, searching for a flaw in Miller's trap. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. His grandfather had written extensively about early rice farming in tight basins. If the water cannot leave the land must move the water. The tactical solution was a closed-loop recirculation system. Edmund did not need to flush the acidic water into Miller's Creek. He could dilute it and transform its chemistry through sheer force of motion. Early the next day, he began a grueling 48-hour modification process. He trenched a temporary 2-inch PVC pipeline from his primary farmstead's deep groundwater, all the way down to the northern edge of the bog basin. He then repositioned the rented diesel pump's massive discharge hose, aiming it away from the property line and running it up a steep incline to dump directly into the highest terrace paddy. When he engaged both systems, the transformation began. Fresh, highly alkaline groundwater from the deep well surged into the system at 100 gallons a minute, immediately diluting the concentrated swamp acid. Simultaneously, the high-volume diesel pump drew the mixed water from the lowest pooling basin and hurled it back to the top of the terrace grid. As the liquid cascaded over the newly constructed clay levees, it churned and bubbled, drawing massive amounts of oxygen from the air. The motion oxidized the latent sulfur compounds, stabilizing the volatile chemistry. Within 4 days, the water shifted from a toxic, jet-black glaze to a healthy, aerated brown. Dr. Reed returned to test the patties, pulling a digital meter from his pocket. The reading was a near-perfect 6.5 pH. It was a staggering intellectual victory. Edmund had bypassed the legal blockade without moving a single drop of water across his rival's line. Balancing the water chemistry was a triumph of engineering, but the terraced patties remained barren basins of mud. To secure the specific semi-dwarf, long-grain rice seed required for direct water seeding, Edmund had to make a final, permanent sacrifice. He drove to a specialized estate dealer in Monroe, carrying his most valued personal possession, a solid gold, antique hunting timepiece that had belonged to his great-grandfather, engraved with the family's original homestead registry date from the 19th century. It was the last physical link to his lineage that carried zero debt. The dealer offered $3,500, a fraction of its historical worth, but precisely enough to purchase 70 bags of certified seed. Edmund took the cash without a word, leaving his history behind to fund his survival. The seed arrived on a flatbed truck the following morning. Because the clay pan remained highly unstable, traditional tractor-pulled grain drills were entirely useless. Any heavy wheel configuration would punch through the delicate crust and rupture the level alignment of the basin floors. The entire 50-acre grid had to be sewn manually. Edmund strapped a heavy canvas, hand-cranked broadcast spreader across his chest, loaded it with 40 pounds of the specialized seed, and stepped off the clay levee into the knee-deep mire. The physical labor was grueling, an agonizing test of endurance. Step by step, Edmund dragged his boots through the thick, viscous mud, turning the manual iron crank with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. With every rotation, a fan-shaped arc of golden grain hissed through the air, settling softly into the aerated water. The weight of the harness dug deep into his shoulders, chafing through his shirt, while the humid Louisiana air turned the basin into a suffocating greenhouse. He worked alone from dawn until dusk, his gaze fixed on the line of the clay berms to ensure an even distribution. The emotional vulnerability was absolute. With every handful of seed that sank beneath the murky surface, Edmund was casting his entire remaining livelihood, his grandfather's watch, and the deed to his ancestral home directly into the mud. If the seeds failed to anchor in the smectite clay, or if the water temperature fluctuated by even a few degrees, the entire investment would dissolve into worthless rot before his eyes. He had no safety net left. His future was buried beneath 2 inches of water. 5 days after the final seed settled into the smectite clay, the air in the southern basin grew eerily still. The relative stability Edmund had fought to establish was instantly shattered by a crackling transmission on his emergency weather radio. An unseasonal, high-velocity squall line had formed over the Gulf of Mexico, drawing intense thermal energy from the unusually warm waters and tracking directly toward Briarwood County. The tactical threat was immediate and total. The storm was projected to drop over 6 inches of water within a single 3-hour window. For a traditional corn or soybean farm, such rain was a severe hindrance. For Edmund's newly engineered rice system, it was an existential execution order. The seeds had not yet developed their primary root anchors. They lay loosely in the top layer of soft mud, entirely dependent on a stable, unmoving 2-inch water blanket to press them into the earth. More dangerously, the winding clay levees that sectioned the 50-acre grid were freshly packed and completely uncured. Without a full season of baking sun to solidify the smectite clay, the structures lacked structural integrity. If the torrential downpour overtopped the narrow berms by even a single inch, the cascading volume would trigger immediate hydraulic erosion. The soft clay walls would dissolve, creating a catastrophic chain reaction blowout that would flush every grain of the $3,500 seed crop directly into Jacob Miller's drainage creek. At midnight, the sky turned a bruised, electric purple as the forward edge of the squall line tore into the valley. Wind gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour slammed into the Pendleton homestead, rattling the tin roof and bending the surrounding oaks nearly to the ground. Edmund stood at his window, watching sheets of horizontal rain obliterate his headlight's beam. A cold, absolute terror gripped his chest. This was not a slow financial strangulation or a legal maneuver by a rival. This was the unchecked, violent wrath of the environment executing a final strike against his defiance. Every dollar he possessed, every hour of backbreaking labor, and the memory of his great-grandfather's watch were sitting out in that dark basin, protected only by fragile walls of mud that were currently dissolving under a historic deluge. He grabbed his heavy slicker, his flashlight, and ran toward the truck, refusing to sit in the dark and watch his survival wash away. The basin was a churning, black inland sea when the headlights of Edmund's truck cut through the horizontal sheets of rain. The whispering bog had vanished, replaced by a single, turbulent body of water that was rapidly rising toward the crests of the fragile clay walls. Flashlight beams revealed that the water level was less than 2 inches from overtopping the primary retaining levee. Hand shovels were an absurdity against this volume of water. Edmund sprinted toward the skeletal cypress tree where the ancient, brakeless Case 80 bulldozer sat exposed to the elements. He scrambled into the open metal seat, his wet boots slipping across the floorboards. The rain stung his eyes, blinding him as he engaged the glow plugs and twisted the ignition key. The starter whined, a pathetic mechanical scraping sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the wind. "Not tonight," Edmund growled, slamming his fist against the steel dashboard. He cycled the ignition again. The starter spat, the engine coughed a heavy plume of black diesel smoke into the tempest, and the old track loader roared to life, its intense vibrations rattling through his bones. Without functional brakes, Edmund threw the machine into forward gear, utilizing the worn steering clutches to guide the nose toward the far eastern edge of the property line. This section bordered a deep, overgrown county drainage ditch that bypassed Jacob Miller's land entirely. The tactical plan was high-stakes precision engineering under fire. He had to carve a controlled, 12-inch relief spillway through the top of the eastern berm to bleed off the excess surface water, without causing a total structural collapse of the levee. The mud fought the machine at every turn. The heavy tracks skidded sideways, drifting dangerously close to the deep interior pools. Gritting his teeth against the cold adrenaline, Edmund rode the left steering clutch, feathering the throttle to maintain alignment. He hit the berm, raising the heavy steel blade just enough to shave the top layer of packed blue clay. The pent-up water did the rest, roaring through the narrow breach like a freight train, cascading safely into the county ditch. For 5 agonizing hours, Edmund sat in the downpour, monitoring the flow until the water level stabilized at a safe depth. He had defied the storm, holding the line with nothing but an ancient machine and absolute resolve. 2 weeks after the storm, the brown water of the basin underwent a silent, spectacular transformation. Piercing the murky surface like millions of translucent emerald needles, the first microscopic shoots of a long-grain rice emerged. The seeds had anchored securely into the smectite clay pan, drawing life from the stabilized, aerated water. Within a week, the Whispering Bog had become a vibrant electric green oasis, a striking contrast to the rest of Briarwood County, which was actively burning up under a renewed, merciless heat wave. While Jacob Miller's sprawling cornfield stood stunted, their dry leaves rattling like paper in the arid wind, Edmund's closed-loop wetland thrived, a testament to unconventional engineering. This visible success was an intolerable insult to Miller's ego. In late June, a deputy delivered a summons to Edmund, an emergency hearing before the Briarwood Water Management Board, instigated by Miller, who claimed Edmund was irresponsibly hoarding and depleting the shared underground aquifer. The threat was absolute. If the board issued a cease and desist order on his well pump, the stagnant water would heat up under the July sun and literally boil the rice roots, destroying the crop within days. The hearing took place on a sweltering Thursday evening in the local high school gymnasium. Miller sat flanked by 2 expensive, tailored attorneys, while the community watched from the bleachers. Mayor Higgins, presiding over the board, banged his gavel. Flooding 50 acres during a catastrophic drought is an extreme allocation of resources, Mr. Pendleton. This board cannot permit one farmer to drain our shared aquifer while his neighbor's crops wither. Edmund did not bluster. He stepped forward with cold, calculating satisfaction, carrying a thick binder of technical data verified by Dr. Reed. He projected a soil conductivity map onto the gym wall. "Your premise is fundamentally flawed, gentlemen," Edmund stated, his voice ringing clearly through the space. "Mr. Miller's sandy loam soil possesses a high percolation rate. His massive irrigation pivots lose 60% of their water to immediate subsurface drainage, forcing him to pump continuously. My acreage is lined with an impermeable layer of smectite blue clay. We filled the paddies exactly once. Because our system is a closed loop, we only pump a fraction of that volume to replace natural evaporation. Acre for acre, we are utilizing 80% less groundwater than Jacob Miller." The gymnasium erupted into murmurs as the board members reviewed the indisputable geological data. Miller's face flushed a deep, furious purple. The technical precision of Edmund's preparation left them with zero legal grounds for a restriction. The complaint was summarily dismissed, marking a massive tactical vindication that turned the tide of public perception. By late August, the rice had entered the hypersensitive booting stage. The thick stalks had grown nearly 3 feet tall, their stems swelling as the delicate panicles, the grain heads, prepared to emerge from the sheath. During this critical physiological phase, the plants were highly sensitive to environmental shock. If the water level dropped by even an inch, the grain heads would emerge empty, producing worthless blanks. The 50-acre basin was a dense, vibrating expanse of deep green, carrying the promise of a historic yield. But the silence of the valley was deceptive. At 2 in the morning on a muggy, moonless Tuesday, a subtle drop in the internal pressure of the recirculation system triggered a warning light on Edmund's dashboard. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and raced down the access road. When he reached the southern boundary line, his beam cut through the dark to reveal a catastrophic sight. A 4-foot-wide, 2-foot-deep trench had been brutally hacked through the primary clay levee. A torrent of vital, aerated water was rushing violently through the breach, draining straight into the woods toward Jacob Miller's property. This was not a natural failure. The jagged spade marks in the raw blue clay were fresh, and the air smelled of freshly churned earth. A blistering, feral anger surged through Edmund's chest, instantly followed by cold calculation. If the basin drained completely by dawn, the thermal shock would destroy the booting rice, rendering months of sacrifice meaningless. He was entirely alone in the dark, facing a brutal race against time. Edmund threw himself into the freezing, rushing current, using his own body to slow the initial velocity of the blowout. He scrambled out to drag heavy, rotting cypress timbers from the tree line, wedging them horizontally across the cut to form a crude structural skeleton. He threw a heavy canvas tarp over the wood, allowing the immense water pressure to suck the fabric flat against the frame, slowing the leak to a dull seep. Then began the true physical torment. For 3 agonizing hours, standing knee-deep in the thick mud, Edmund shoveled raw, sticky blue clay directly onto the barrier. His muscles screamed, his lower back seized into painful knots, and his hands bled through his work gloves. By 5 in the morning, the breach was finally sealed. Covered in black mud and shivering from exhaustion, Edmund shone his flashlight across the grass. There, glinting in the pale light, lay a custom-forged steel pipe wrench stamped with the initials. C.H. Cole Harris, Jacob Miller's ruthless farm foreman. The psychological stakes had shifted permanently. His rival was no longer just utilizing lawyers. He was willing to commit criminal acts to ensure Edmund's destruction. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line when Edmund's truck tore up the long, manicured gravel driveway of the Miller estate, leaving deep, violent ruts across the pristine lawn. He parked directly at the base of the grand front porch. Jacob Miller stepped outside, a porcelain mug in hand, his posture radiating a smug, untouchable calm. Behind him stood Cole Harris, his arms crossed over his chest, his face devoid of expression. Edmund didn't say a word. He climbed the wooden steps, his boots caked in the blue clay of the sabotaged levee, and slammed the heavy steel pipe wrench down onto the glass patio table. The impact was explosive, The tempered glass shattered into thousands of jagged shards that rained across the porch floor. Harris flinched, instinctively taking a half-step back. Edmund stepped into Miller's personal space, his gaze locked dead onto his rival's eyes, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You tell your foreman here that if I catch him on my acreage again, he won't just be leaving his tools behind. He won't be leaving at all." Miller's smug composure instantly evaporated, replaced by a flash of genuine, pale unease. He had anticipated a broken man coming to beg for terms. He had not prepared for this feral, unyielding defiance. "Get off my property, Pendleton, before I call the authorities," Miller muttered, his voice tightening. "I've got exactly 21 days until the combines roll, Jacob," Edmund said, backing down the steps without breaking eye contact. "I'm going to bring in the heaviest harvest this county has ever seen. And you're going to sit right here on your dying land and watch me do it." The final 3 weeks transformed the Whispering Bog into a fortified zone of high-intensity suspense. Edmund pitched a canvas hunting tent directly into the bed of his John Deere pickup truck, parking it at the highest vantage point along the primary clay levee. He loaded his lever-action hunting rifle, resting it across his knees beneath the sweltering heat of the day and the pitch-black, mosquito-infested nights. He and Sarah maintained a relentless, alternating 12-hour watch, guarding the 50-acre perimeter against further incursions. Running on pure adrenaline exhaustion and black coffee, Edmund lived in a state of hypervigilance, his ears tuned to every snapping twig in the dark woods. Under his watchful protection, the electric green oasis began to shift, the heavy panicles turning a brilliant, shimmering golden yellow as the grain hardened, bowing the thick stalks toward the earth. The line had been held. The final battle was at hand. The golden hour of harvest arrived, but draining the basin revealed a final tactical nightmare. The top crust had dried, but beneath it lay a slippery, unsolidified pudding of smectite clay. A standard 30,000-pound combine would sink to its axles instantly. Edmund tracked down Wallace Henderson, a rogue mechanic who had modified an ancient combine with triangular, military-grade steel tracks. The Frankenstein machine crawled onto the mire, its wide footprint dispersing the immense weight perfectly. For 3 brutal days, the tracked beast churned through the mud, stripping the bog of its treasure. The yield was a staggering, historic 220 bushels per acre. Edmund hauled the 4 overloaded rigs to the Briarwood Grain Cooperative, but the facility manager, a pawn of Jacob Miller's board, claimed the grain was rejected due to a fabricated fungal infection. It was a rigged execution. Raw rice ferments into worthless compost within 48 hours if left undried. Edmund didn't break. Utilizing an emergency credit override, he ordered the convoy to race westward onto Interstate 10, running a white-knuckle marathon across state lines to a USDA-governed facility in Beaumont, Texas. The federal inspectors marveled at the pristine quality. The grain was flawlessly clean, securing an immediate payout of $79,200. The profound silence of total vindication settled over the Pendleton farm. Edmund redeemed Sarah's antique heirloom from the regional dealers and paid off the ancestral mortgage in full before the bank's deadline. The final reckoning materialized that winter. Jacob Miller's strategy of overpumping the dry aquifer had utterly ruined his soil, leaving him default-strapped when corporate lenders called in his massive equipment loans. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Edmund sat in the back row of the courthouse arena as Miller's 2,000-acre estate was put up for public foreclosure auction. Miller sat stripped of his arrogance, staring hollow-eyed at the floor. Edmund stood up, gave his bankrupted rival a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, and walked out into the crisp air. He had no need for expanding acreage. 50 acres of mud had saved his legacy. If this relentless fight against overwhelming odds inspired you, don't let the narrative end here. Support the grit of true independent underdogs by liking and sharing this account of resilience. Subscribe and engage the notification bell to ensure you never miss our next high-end documentary chronicle of survival, strategy, and ultimate human triumph against the elements.